He slid the check across the table without meeting my eyes, his tone sharp and dismissive. "You've always covered it, haven't you?" That one line hit me harder than any insult ever could. In that moment, every dollar I had poured into my family came crashing back like a tidal wave. Over $400,000 across 8 long years. Birthdays I paid for, medical bills I covered, vacations they bragged about but never contributed to. I remembered wiring money at 2 in the morning so the lights wouldn't be shut off in my parents' house, writing checks while pretending I wasn't behind on my own rent, and hearing them laugh together on the phone later, thinking I wasn't around, calling me their cash cow. I swallowed it for years, convincing myself that's what family does. You give, you sacrifice, you hold everyone else up, even when it breaks you down. But the way he said it that night, like it was my duty, like I owed them my very existence, it made something inside me snap. I knew then that this wasn't family, it was exploitation dressed up as love, and they were about to learn that I wasn't going to play their game anymore. I grew up as the oldest daughter in a family that never once pretended to hide where I stood. My brother was the golden child, the one who could crash a car at 17 and be handed another set of keys the next week, while I was the one expected to clean up the mess, keep the peace, and somehow pay for it all. From the time I was barely out of college, every phone call from home came with a price tag attached. "Sweetheart, we just need a little help with the mortgage." "Olivia, your father's health insurance premium went up again." "It's your brother's wedding, and we really want to do it properly." At first, I said yes because I loved them and because I thought that's what success was for, to share. I had worked brutal hours at my first corporate job, pouring myself into late nights and missed weekends, and the salary that felt like freedom quickly turned into everyone else's safety net. Year after year, I kept telling myself it was temporary, that one day they'd stand on their own. But instead, the requests grew bolder, larger, more entitled. I was paying for car repairs I didn't drive, for medical bills I never saw, for vacations I wasn't invited to. And still, whenever I visited, they'd smile to my face while whispering behind my back, thinking I couldn't hear, that I was nothing more than their cash cow. I remember once coming home for Christmas, walking past the kitchen door just in time to hear my aunt chuckle and say, "Olivia will handle it, she always does," and the way my mother didn't correct her, just laughed along like it was a family joke. I laughed too, at least on the outside, but inside it cut me open. I wanted so badly to believe it wasn't true, that they valued me for more than what I provided. But 8 years and $400,000 later, it was undeniable. They had stopped seeing me as a daughter or a sister. To them, I was an endless account they could withdraw from whenever life got inconvenient. And still, I kept paying, even when it meant skipping meals to cover their debts, even when my credit card balance screamed louder than my pride. Because the truth is, I was afraid that if I stopped, I'd lose them altogether. Afraid that the love I thought I was buying would disappear the moment the money did. The turning point came on a night I can still replay in every detail. It was my brother's 35th birthday, and they insisted on throwing him a grand party even though he hadn't worked steadily in years. They rented a hall with chandeliers, hired a band, and ordered enough food to feed 200 guests. I remember staring at the glossy invitation and thinking, who's paying for all this? I already knew the answer. Sure enough, 2 weeks before the event, my mother called with her practiced sigh. "Olivia, the caterer wants half the money up front. Can you cover it? We'll pay you back after the gifts come in." Gifts. As if the entire family hadn't been using me as their personal ATM for nearly a decade. I wanted to say no. I wanted to scream into the phone, but instead I heard my own voice give in again. The day of the party, I showed up in a dress I bought on clearance because I couldn't afford anything else after writing a 5-figure check for the venue deposit. Everyone was dressed to impress, laughing, drinking, dancing under fairy lights I had unknowingly paid for, and not one person looked at me with gratitude. Instead, I heard whispers when they thought the music covered them. My cousin muttering, "Of course she paid. She always does." My uncle chuckling, "The family's cash cow strikes again." My hands shook so badly I had to grip my wine glass with both, the stem nearly snapping between my fingers. Then came the moment that sealed it. My father stood up to give a toast, lifting his glass high and said, "We're so lucky to have family who always steps up. Some people know how to provide." The room erupted in applause, eyes darting toward me, not with pride or love, but with expectation, as if I was a character in their play whose role was never allowed to change. My cheeks burned. I smiled like a trained performer while inside I shattered. That night, as I drove home alone, I gripped the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white, tears blurring the road. I realized I had funded every milestone of their lives while postponing my own. I had given them my time, my money, my stability, and all they had given me in return was a nickname that reduced me to livestock. And in that car, with the smell of cheap perfume clinging to my dress and the echo of their laughter still in my ears, I made a quiet vow. I would never let them humiliate me again. They thought I was their endless supply. They were about to find out I was done. The very next week, I stopped answering their calls. My phone buzzed with missed messages, first polite, then impatient, then furious. "Olivia, the electricity bill is overdue. We need help with the car insurance. Your brother's credit card is maxed out again." Every text was a demand dressed up as a plea. And every time I ignored it, the knot in my stomach loosened a little more. For the first time in 8 years, I let their problems stay their problems. And that's when the storm began. My mother showed up at my apartment door one morning, face tight with disapproval. She didn't ask how I was, didn't comment on the dark circles under my eyes from working double shifts, didn't notice the stack of unopened bills on my counter. She just walked in like she owned the place and said, "What's this about you refusing to help? You know we depend on you." I stared at her, exhausted beyond words, and for once I didn't fold. I told her calmly, "I'm not your provider. I'm your daughter. And I'm done." She blinked at me like I had spoken in another language. Then came the accusations. Selfish, ungrateful, heartless. "After everything we've done for you, you're going to abandon us?" She hissed, as if feeding me and raising me was some kind of investment they were cashing in on now. I stayed silent, and that silence broke something in her. She left in a fury, slamming the door hard enough to rattle the frame. Hours later, the group chat lit up with messages from relatives. "How could you do this to your family?" "Money isn't everything, Olivia, but loyalty is. If you don't want to be part of us, just say so." They wanted me guilty, cornered, crawling back like before. But I didn't. Instead, I called my bank, blocked their access to the joint account I had once naively set up for emergencies, and froze every credit card I had ever allowed them to touch. I printed statements, highlighting every transfer, every payment, every so-called loan that was never repaid. Line after line, the total climbed until it stared back at me in black and white. $412,378. A number that was more than money. It was my 20s, my sanity, my stolen years. Seeing it written made my resolve absolute. They hadn't just used me. They had drained me dry and laughed while doing it. And if they thought they could shame me back into line, they were about to learn how wrong they were. The fallout spread faster than I could have imagined. My brother called me one evening, slurring his words from too much whiskey, demanding to know why his card was declined at the gas station. "You ruined my night, Olivia," he barked, as if his inability to buy beer was somehow my fault. I told him flatly, "It was never your card to begin with, it was mine. And it's over." He went silent for a beat, then exploded, calling me pathetic, accusing me of loving money more than family. The next day, my aunt posted a passive-aggressive rant on Facebook about relatives who forget their blood ties once they taste success, and I knew it was about me. The comments piled in, family members who had never lifted a finger for me suddenly preaching about duty and loyalty. I didn't respond, but I screenshotted every word. I wanted a record of how quickly love evaporated the moment the cash dried up. Within a month, the mask fell completely. My father showed up at my workplace, red-faced and loud, demanding I reconsider before I destroyed this family. He cornered me in the lobby in front of my coworkers, waving a stack of unpaid bills like evidence in a trial. I felt their eyes on me, pitying glances mixing with confusion, but I stood my ground. I told him calmly that if he didn't leave, I would call security. His mouth dropped open. He couldn't fathom that the obedient daughter who had once begged for scraps of his approval was finally drawing a line. He stormed out, cursing under his breath, and my manager later pulled me aside, asking if everything was okay. For the first time in my life, I told the truth. My family has been exploiting me for years. Saying it out loud was like cutting chains I had carried so long I forgot they weren't part of me. After that, the silence from home became deafening. Days stretched into weeks without a call. Then, out of nowhere, a letter arrived. An actual handwritten letter from my mother. She wrote that they had counted on me, that they built their lives assuming I'd always be there to cover the gaps, that without me, they were drowning. She begged me to come back, to do the right thing, but between the lines I could see it clearly. It wasn't love, it was desperation. And in the closing sentence, she couldn't resist twisting the knife. Don't forget you're the strong one, the provider. We can't survive without you. I read it twice, then folded it neatly and placed it in the same folder as the bank statements and screenshots. To me, it wasn't a plea. It was proof. Proof that I had never been a daughter in their eyes, only an asset. The breaking point came when I learned just how far they had taken things behind my back. One afternoon, I got a call from a collections agency asking about a loan I had supposedly co-signed for my brother. My stomach dropped because I had never signed anything. When I asked for details, they sent me scanned paperwork with my name, my address, even a shaky imitation of my signature at the bottom. My own family had forged my consent to pull out a $30,000 loan, and they hadn't even bothered to tell me. I felt the blood drain from my face as I read through the contract, seeing the repayment schedule already in default, penalties mounting. I marched straight to the bank the next morning with the evidence and filed a fraud report. The manager raised his brows when he saw who the loan was for, murmuring, "It's unusual when it comes from family." Unusual, maybe, but not surprising to me anymore. That same day, I called a lawyer. I laid out the entire story from the beginning, the transfers, the bills, the forged signature, and he didn't look shocked at all. He told me calmly, "You've been enabling financial abuse, and now they've escalated into criminal territory. The best thing you can do is protect yourself legally, immediately." Those words hit me like a slap. Abuse. I had thought of it as duty, as family obligation, but he named it for what it really was. By the end of that week, restraining measures were in place. I froze every shared account, filed identity theft protection, and had official letters sent to every member of my family. Any attempt to use my information or pressure me for money would result in legal action. No exceptions. When the letters landed, the silence broke like glass. My phone blew up with rage. My brother screaming that I had ruined his life, my father spitting venom about betrayal, my mother alternating between sobbing and cursing. "How could you do this to us? We're your blood," they shouted, but I didn't flinch this time. Because I finally understood that blood doesn't entitle anyone to break you. That night, sitting in my apartment with the stack of legal documents beside me, I felt lighter than I had in years. I knew the war wasn't over. They wouldn't let go without a fight. But for the first time, I wasn't afraid. The fight escalated exactly as I expected. Within weeks, I was dragged into the mud of family drama that spilled everywhere. On social media, in my workplace, even among distant cousins who hadn't spoken to me in years but suddenly felt entitled to judge. My brother showed up outside my building once, pounding on my door, screaming for me to fix this mess, because the loan company had started garnishing his wages. He yelled so loudly the neighbors called the police, and when the officers arrived, I didn't cover for him the way I once would have. I handed them the forged documents and said, clear as day, "That's my brother, and he committed fraud in my name." Watching them put him in handcuffs, hearing him spit my name like a curse as they led him away, it should have broken me. Instead, it steadied me. I thought of every time I had skipped paying my own bills to cover his, every time he mocked me behind my back, and I felt no guilt. Just relief. The smear campaign online grew uglier. My aunt posted that I had sold out my family to the courts. My father claimed I had always been cold and calculating, and strangers messaged me threats because they believed their version of the story. But the difference was, this time I had receipts. I released nothing at first, letting their lies swirl, until one evening I quietly posted a single screenshot, a redacted bank statement showing tens of thousands wired to my parents over the years, captioned simply, 8 years, $400,000. You decide. Within hours, the tide shifted. People who had once piled on fell silent. A few even messaged apologies. My family went quiet too because they knew I had more. Texts, contracts, forged signatures. I didn't need to scream. I didn't need to defend myself with anger. The truth was louder than anything they could throw at me. Still, behind the silence, I could feel their rage simmering. They hadn't just lost my money. They had lost control. And for people who thrived on exploiting me, that was the worst loss of all. The court process dragged everything into the light in a way I don't think my family ever expected. When my lawyer filed the fraud case against my brother, the investigators dug deeper, uncovering a trail of financial manipulation that stretched back years. It wasn't just the forged loan. There were credit cards opened in my name, utilities linked to my address, even a store account I had never used but had somehow been paying off for months. Every detail was documented, every receipt collected, and suddenly their whispers of me being a cash cow became evidence of exploitation. In hearings, I sat quietly in tailored suits I could barely afford, while my brother raged and my parents glared across the room like I was the traitor who had burned down our home. But when the judge asked directly, "Did you or did you not forge your sister's signature?" my brother faltered, stammering excuses about desperation and family. The judge's gavel was merciless. He was ordered to repay what he could, placed on probation, and warned that another offense would lead to prison. My parents weren't charged, but the financial records made it impossible for them to play the victims anymore. Their reputation in the community began to crumble. Neighbors whispered, relatives pulled away. The same people who once applauded them at parties now looked at them with suspicion. And me? For the first time in years, I felt the ground under my feet was mine. Walking out of that courthouse, I breathed air that didn't taste of debt or manipulation. Still, it wasn't victory that filled me. It was something quieter, sharper. The certainty that they would try to come back, to guilt me, to twist the narrative again. They had lost money, pride, even credibility, but what they couldn't stand losing most was their grip on me. I knew another confrontation was coming. And this time I was ready. The confrontation came sooner than I thought. It was a Sunday morning when I heard the knock at my door, slow and deliberate, the kind of knock that already carries a demand. When I opened it, my mother stood there, eyes red, clutching a folder to her chest. She stepped inside uninvited, sat down at my kitchen table, and slid the folder across to me. Inside were photographs of family gatherings, letters I'd written as a teenager, even an old birthday card where I had promised to always take care of everyone. She pointed at that line and said, voice trembling, "You swore, Olivia. You swore you'd never abandon us." I stared at her, stunned by the audacity of using my childhood words as a contract for lifelong servitude. She wept, telling me the bills were piling higher than ever, that my brother couldn't find work with a fraud charge hanging over him, that my father's health was failing. "You're all we have," she pleaded. "Don't you see?" But this time I did see, more clearly than ever. I saw the manipulation woven through every tear, the same pattern that had trapped me for years. I told her calmly, "I was a child when I wrote that, and I am not your safety net anymore." She froze, the tears vanishing as quickly as they'd come, replaced by a cold glare. "Then you're no daughter of mine," she spat, standing so quickly the chair screeched against the tile. For a heartbeat, I thought I'd collapse under the weight of her words, but instead I felt strangely free. I followed her to the door and added quietly, "If being your daughter means being your property, then I don't want the title." She left without another word, and as the door shut behind her, I felt the final tether snap. There was no going back now. They would rage. They would smear me. They would call me names until their throats ran dry. But they would never again call me their cash cow. And for the first time, that truth was enough. The smear campaign reached its peak after that. My mother must have told every relative within driving distance that I had abandoned them in their time of need, because suddenly cousins I hadn't spoken to since childhood were sending me long, guilt-soaked messages about family unity and forgiveness. One even accused me of being brainwashed by my lawyer, as if taking control of my own life could only be explained by outside manipulation. My father, meanwhile, started spreading rumors at church, painting himself as a proud man broken by his greedy daughter. People I'd known since childhood avoided me in the grocery store, while others stared openly, whispers following me down the aisle. It stung, I won't lie, but every time I felt that old urge to defend myself, I reminded myself of the folder with $412 through $378 worth of proof sitting in my apartment. I owed no explanations, and then one evening, I received a message I didn't expect. It was from my father's sister, my estranged aunt, who had been cut off from the family years ago after a falling out. She wrote, "I believe you. They did the same to me until I walked away. Don't let them pull you back in." My hands shook as I read her words, because for the first time, someone in the family validated my reality instead of denying it. She told me how she had lent money for years, how they twisted guilt into obligation, how walking away was the only reason she had survived financially. I realized then that I wasn't just breaking a cycle for myself. I was exposing a pattern that had destroyed more than one life. The smear campaign no longer felt like a wall pressing me in. It felt like noise, desperate and hollow, from people terrified of losing their grip. And slowly, the silence grew. Fewer texts, fewer posts, fewer staged confrontations. It was as if they had finally understood I wasn't coming back. The silence didn't mean peace. It meant regrouping. A few months later, I got an envelope in the mail with no return address. Inside was a single sheet of paper, a bill of sale for my parents' house, my name typed neatly on the guarantor line. My breath caught because I had never signed anything like it, but the signature was there, another sloppy forgery. They had tried again. This time I didn't waste a second. I called my lawyer, who immediately contacted the bank and placed a fraud alert, and within days the paperwork was flagged as invalid. But the very fact that they had stooped to this level, even after everything that had already happened, told me exactly who they were. They weren't going to change. They weren't going to apologize. They were going to keep trying to bleed me until there was nothing left, unless I made it impossible. So I did. I filed for a no-contact order, legally barring them from harassing me further. When the papers were served, my father called from an unknown number, leaving a voicemail so full of rage I still remember every word. "You think you're better than us? You think you can erase your family? When we're gone and you're standing at our graves, you'll know what you've done." I replayed it once, then saved it in my growing archive of evidence, but I didn't cry this time, because in truth, I had already grieved the loss of my family years before. Grieved every time they laughed behind my back, every time they called me their cash cow, every time they chose my wallet over my well-being. Losing them now was just a formality. What I gained in return was something I hadn't felt since I was a teenager: freedom. I took a trip alone to the coast, something I had never been able to justify before because every spare dollar went to them. I stood barefoot in the sand, listening to the waves crash, realizing that for the first time in nearly a decade, I was spending my money on myself. No frantic phone calls interrupting the moment, no guilt demanding I cut the trip short, no texts asking for transfers. Just me, the ocean, and the quiet knowledge that I had finally stepped out of the role they had written for me. Still, a part of me wrestled with the question, was I cruel? Was I heartless for cutting off the very people who raised me? But then I'd look at the folder of documents, at the forged signatures, at the totaled $412,378 that could have been a house, an investment, a future, and the answer crystallized. Protecting myself wasn't cruelty. It was survival. And if anyone still doubted that, they hadn't lived as the family's designated provider until their bones ached from it. I was done justifying it. Not long after that trip, the final fracture came in a way I couldn't have scripted better. A cousin reached out quietly, almost whispering through her messages, telling me my parents had started spinning a new story, that I had stolen from them. She wrote that at a recent gathering, my father claimed I had siphoned money from family accounts to fund my lifestyle, that I had drained them dry and left them in ruins. The sheer absurdity of it made me laugh out loud in my kitchen, because anyone who had seen my tiny apartment or the secondhand clothes hanging in my closet knew I wasn't living large. But this time, I didn't sit still. I gathered the documents, the screenshots, the bank transfers, and I wrote my own letter. This one not for my family, but for the entire extended circle that had been fed lies for years. I printed copies, mailed them to every relative whose address I could find. And for the first time in 8 years, the truth wasn't just something I carried alone. It was on paper, undeniable, stamped and sealed. Within days, the calls began, not from my parents, but from cousins, uncles, even distant relatives I barely knew. Some apologized, embarrassed they had believed the lies. Others were furious at my parents for dragging them into a mess built on manipulation. The narrative shifted almost overnight. My parents weren't victims anymore, they were exposed. And though I never asked for it, word traveled beyond family, into their church, their community, their neighbors' gossip, their perfect facade cracked wide open. People they had leaned on for sympathy began avoiding them, and for once, the isolation was theirs to bear. I didn't celebrate it. I didn't post about it online or dance on the ruins of their reputation. I simply lived. I moved to a better apartment, signed a lease with my name alone, bought furniture without wondering what bill I'd have to skip to cover it. At work, I finally applied for a promotion I had put off for years because I was too busy handling everyone else's emergencies. And when I got it, I didn't tell a soul in my family. That victory was mine alone. Yet sometimes, late at night, the doubt crept in again. Had I been too harsh? Too final? But then I remembered the forged loan papers, the fake signature, the years of ridicule behind closed doors. And I realized the truth. They had abandoned me long before I ever walked away. Months passed, and with each one the weight on my chest grew lighter. I stopped checking my phone for their names, stopped waiting for the next guilt-laced demand, stopped rehearsing arguments in my head that I'd never get to win. For the first time since my early 20s, my money was mine, my choices were mine, my life was mine. And yet, like clockwork, they tried again, only this time through lawyers. A thick envelope arrived by certified mail, demanding I provide compensation for the financial damage my so-called abandonment had caused. My parents, through legal channels, were now claiming I had made a verbal promise to support them indefinitely and that I had broken that promise. I sat in my lawyer's office while he skimmed the letter, shaking his head, then actually laughed. "This isn't a case," he said, sliding it back to me. "This is desperation written on letterhead." He drafted a sharp response, attaching the mountain of evidence we had already compiled, and within weeks their so-called claim was dismissed. But what struck me most was the brazenness. They truly believed that even the law could be twisted into their safety net. That day I stopped doubting myself forever. If they were willing to lie in court filings, to rewrite history and paint me as a villain after everything I had given, then I owed them nothing but distance. And so I went further. I sold my car, bought a new one under a fresh registration, changed my phone number, and relocated to a different part of the city. I built a new life where their shadows couldn't follow me, where no neighbor would whisper about family drama, where every dollar I earned stretched into my future instead of disappearing into theirs. And slowly, something unexpected bloomed: peace. I started cooking at home, rediscovering flavors I once thought too indulgent because I couldn't justify spending on myself. I went out with friends without the gnawing fear that I'd need to leave early to wire money. I even started dating again, and when I told him about my past, he didn't flinch or pity me. He admired me. "You broke the chain," he said one night over dinner, and I realized how rare that was. Most people spend a lifetime caught in toxic cycles, but I had clawed my way out, scars and all. Still, there were nights when the loneliness pressed in, when I missed the idea of family even if the reality had been poison. But then I'd remember the sound of their laughter when they called me a cash cow, the sting of my father's words in that toast, the forged documents with my name scribbled by someone else's hand. And the longing dissolved, replaced by certainty. I hadn't lost family. I had lost people who never truly saw me as one of them. A year after cutting them off, I thought maybe the storm had finally ended. I had moved into a small but beautiful townhouse with tall windows that let the morning sun spill across the floor, and for once, the only bills on my counter were mine. Life felt almost unrecognizable, quiet, manageable mine. But then came the call I knew would arrive one day. A distant cousin reached out, voice low and hesitant, telling me my father had been hospitalized. He said the family was panicking about the costs, about how they couldn't keep up without me, about how this was the moment to step up. My stomach twisted, not out of guilt, but out of recognition. They hadn't changed at all. Even now, with everything exposed, with the law on my side, with years of exploitation laid bare, their first instinct was to look for my wallet. I thanked him for letting me know, then asked, did they call to tell me he was sick or to ask for money? There was a long pause before he admitted it was the latter. That was my answer. I didn't show up at the hospital. I didn't wire a dime. I didn't allow myself to be pulled back into the cycle under the banner of pity. And yes, I cried that night, not because of what I didn't give, but because of what I had lost long ago. The father who should have protected me, the mother who should have nurtured me, the brother who should have stood beside me. Those people didn't exist. What existed was a family machine that saw me as a resource, not a person. And I had finally unplugged myself from it. Weeks later, word spread that my father had been discharged, that the bills were crushing them, that my brother was drinking more heavily than ever, that my mother had stopped going out of shame. And while the old me would have been wrecked with guilt, the new me simply breathed easier. Their downfall wasn't my doing. It was the inevitable collapse of a house built on taking without giving. Meanwhile, my own life expanded in ways I hadn't dared imagine. I booked a trip abroad, walked the streets of Paris at sunrise, stood on bridges overlooking the Seine, and thought about how far I had come from the girl who once emptied her bank account to keep her parents' lights on. I sat in cafes, ordered coffee without flinching at the price, because every cent was mine. No strings. No guilt, just me. And it was in Paris, of all places, that I finally wrote the words I had carried in my chest for years. I am not your cash cow. I am not your provider. I am not your sacrifice. I am me. I closed the journal, and for the first time, I didn't feel like a runaway. I felt like someone who had finally come home. To herself. When I came back from Paris, I knew something had shifted permanently. I had walked through streets where no one knew my name, no one knew my past, and no one expected a single thing from me. That freedom clung to me even after my plane touched down, and I promised myself I would never again live in chains forged by obligation. Back home, I poured my energy into building the life I had postponed for so long. I finished certifications I had delayed because my money was always spoken for. I invested carefully, watching my savings grow for the first time in a decade. I bought myself a piano, something I had dreamed of since childhood but never allowed, because family needs always came first. Now, when I pressed the keys at night, the sound filled my home with something money could never buy: peace. But peace didn't mean silence. Word of my independence filtered back to them. I know because one night I received an email from my brother written like a confession. He said the family was unraveling, that my mother cried every day, that my father barely spoke, that bills stacked higher than ever, that he couldn't find work because of his record. And then, at the end, the familiar twist of the knife. But you could fix all of this. You always could. I stared at the screen for a long time, feeling the ghost of the old Olivia, the one who would have pulled out her checkbook, who would have rushed in to rescue them, who would have bled herself dry just to be called a daughter again. But that Olivia was gone. I didn't reply. Instead, I dragged the email into a folder marked proof and shut my laptop. The next morning, I went for a run along the river, breathing crisp air, feeling my lungs expand without the weight of obligation pressing down on them. My phone buzzed with more messages that day, desperate, manipulative, some even threatening, but I ignored them all. The more I ignored, the weaker they became. I realized then that they weren't just addicted to my money. They were addicted to the control it gave them over me. By taking that away, I hadn't just cut off their finances, I had dismantled their power. And as their world shrank, mine grew. I was promoted again at work, my circle of friends widened, and the man I had been quietly dating knelt on one knee in a little garden filled with string lights and asked me to marry him. I said yes, not because I needed saving, but because for once I had chosen someone who loved me for me, not for what I could give, not for what I could cover, not for the money in my account. That night, holding his hand, I realized I had already lived through a marriage of sorts, a marriage to my family's demands, and leaving it was the most liberating divorce of my life. As my wedding day approached, I knew the whispers would find their way back to my family. And they did. I hadn't sent an invitation, but somehow they learned of it through the same cousin network that had always carried gossip faster than truth. One evening, a thick white envelope appeared in my mailbox with no return address. Inside was a single note written in my mother's sharp, slanted handwriting. "Family is forever. If you go through with this without us, you'll regret it." I stared at the words, feeling that old familiar sting, but instead of fear, a wave of calm washed over me. It wasn't a blessing. It wasn't love. It was another attempt to control, another reminder that in their minds, my milestones existed only if they could take credit for them. I didn't reply. On the morning of my wedding, as I slipped into a gown I had paid for myself, standing in a room filled with friends who had become my chosen family, I felt no emptiness. When I walked down the aisle, I wasn't thinking of who wasn't there. I was thinking of everything I had survived to get here. During the reception, under fairy lights strung across the courtyard, my husband squeezed my hand and whispered, "You look free." And he was right. I wasn't just celebrating a marriage. I was celebrating the fact that I had walked away from being their provider, their scapegoat, their so-called cash cow. Weeks later, a distant relative forwarded me a rant my father had posted online, calling me a traitor to her blood and insisting that one day I'd come crawling back. I read it once, then deleted it, because the truth was, I didn't feel the need to prove myself anymore. Their voices had become background noise, like static on a radio I no longer tuned to. Instead, I focused on building a future where my worth wasn't measured in dollars siphoned off into someone else's debts, but in the life I created for myself. And the most shocking part was how quickly that life blossomed once I stopped feeding the endless hunger of others. Vacations, investments, laughter in my own home that wasn't tinged with resentment. Even the simple luxury of waking up on a Saturday with nothing demanded of me except to decide how I wanted to spend the day. For years I had believed that walking away would make me empty. But the truth was the opposite. Walking away made room for everything I had been missing. And with every passing month, the memory of being called their cash cow lost its sting, replaced by a single unshakable truth. I was never livestock. I was never a bank account. I was never theirs to exploit. I was, and always would be, my own. 2 years into my new life, the final collapse of my family's illusion reached me like an echo from a past I no longer belonged to. A former neighbor called me out of the blue, her voice low, telling me my parents had lost their house. Foreclosure. She said boxes had been dragged out onto the lawn, my mother sobbing loudly enough for the street to hear, my father shouting at anyone who stopped to watch. And in the middle of it all, my brother pacing with a cigarette, blaming everyone but himself. The neighbor's voice softened when she added, "They kept saying, if only Olivia had helped, none of this would have happened." I closed my eyes and let the words sink in, not as an accusation, but as confirmation. Even at rock bottom, they couldn't see their choices. Even when the walls they built on my back finally caved in, they still clung to the fantasy that I was their savior. I didn't rush over. I didn't send money. I didn't even offer condolences. I simply thanked the neighbor for telling me, hung up and sat in silence, staring at the life around me, the shelves filled with books I had bought myself, the photographs of my travels, the home I had chosen, the husband who loved me for who I was. Everything they had tried to drain from me had been rebuilt stronger without them. Weeks later, my brother emailed me again, this time less angry and more desperate. He wrote that they were living in a cramped rental, that my father's health was worsening, that my mother barely left the couch. He begged me to step in one last time. I read it twice, then archived it with the rest. There would always be another one last time. That phrase had chained me for 8 years, and I had broken it forever. What he didn't realize was that their downfall was never mine to fix. It was theirs to own. Their choices, their entitlement, their refusal to stand on their own feet, it had finally caught up to them. And for once, I wasn't holding the safety net underneath. I wasn't cruel enough to wish for their suffering, but I was strong enough to let it play out. Because the truth is, I had already spent nearly $500,000 paying for their survival. I had already given up years of my life for their comfort. And now, finally, I was giving myself permission to live. My story wasn't about their collapse. It was about my freedom. And no foreclosure, no rumor, no plea would ever take that back from me. The last time I heard their voices, it wasn't through a phone call or a knock at my door. It was through a lawyer's letter, one final desperate attempt to claw their way back into my life. The letter accused me of abandoning my moral duty as a daughter, demanded restitution for emotional damages, and even hinted that my refusal to help had directly caused their downfall. I remember sitting at my desk, holding those pages in my hands and laughing, not because it was funny, but because it was so painfully predictable. After everything, the forged loans, the fake signatures, the public humiliation, the smear campaigns, they still believed I was their answer. They still believed I could be guilted into playing savior. I didn't even bother calling my lawyer. I shredded the papers piece by piece until nothing of them remained. And in that moment, it hit me with a clarity so sharp it felt like light cutting through fog. I wasn't their victim anymore. I wasn't their bank. I wasn't their pawn. I was free. From then on, I built a life that was mine in every sense. My husband and I traveled the world, from the cliffs of Santorini to the streets of Kyoto, savoring every sunrise as if it was a gift I had earned by surviving the storm. We bought a home together, not the grandest, but one filled with warmth, with laughter, with a kind of stability I had never known. And when our first child was born, I held him in my arms and swore he would never know what it felt like to be used by the people who should have protected him. He would grow up knowing love as unconditional, not transactional. He would grow up with parents who valued him for who he was, not what he could provide. And in quiet moments, rocking him to sleep, I realized the truest revenge I had ever taken wasn't the legal battles, wasn't the no-contact orders, wasn't the exposure of their lies. It was this, living a life so full, so peaceful, so untainted by their control that their names no longer had power over me. Sometimes people ask if I'll ever reconcile, if I'll ever look back and forgive. And maybe one day I'll find some version of forgiveness in my heart. Not for them, but for myself. So the scars don't harden into bitterness. But reconciliation? No. You can't reconcile with people who never saw you as human. You can't reconcile with people who laughed at your sacrifices, who reduced you to a paycheck, who turned your love into a contract. What I can do is tell my story, not as a confession of pain, but as a declaration of survival. Because there are others like me. Women who carry the weight of entire families on their shoulders, who are told their worth is measured in what they give, who are mocked for saying no. And to those women I say, you are not their cash cow. You are not their endless supply. You are not obligated to destroy yourself to keep others afloat. The greatest act of courage is not holding on, it's letting go. And sometimes the sweetest revenge isn't punishment at all. It's walking away, building a better life, and never looking back. That's what I did, and that's what saved me.